So I'm going to say good morning, good afternoon and good evening to people all over the world who are joining us for the 5th IPRA OECD Pensions Conference. And for those who don't know me, my name is Hazel Bateman and I'm the President of the International Pension Research Association. And this is a new association which we introduced to people at the 4th annual conference in Paris last June. And we're going to officially launch for membership today. So we'll be talking a little bit more about it as we go through the proceedings. Now, I'm speaking to you today from Sydney. And in Australia, for events like this, we pay tribute to the traditional custodians of the land upon which a meeting takes place. Now, you're all over the world, but I'm in Sydney. And so before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. So, the theme for the conference this year is Pension Challenges and Opportunities. And this theme was developed by the IPRA Executive Committee, which largely comprises representatives of the founding organisations, which are NEPSPA, CEPAR, the Pension Research Council and the OECD. And this group involves John Pigott, Lars Verker, Monica Butler, Olivia Mitchell, Pablo Antolin, and Mike Orzag and myself. And when we were thinking about what to put on the program, we had a lot of conversations and we were motivated to begin with by whether ongoing pension reforms were actually meeting expectations. Now, this was before COVID hit, and perhaps after COVID, we might have thought about some different themes. But I think particularly with COVID, we really do need to sit back and ask these questions about whether pension reforms are meeting expectations. And so in session 3 today, we'll have a number of papers which look directly on that. We also had discussions about the take-up and potential use of technology in pensions, and that's the subject of our session 2. And then we also had discussions about ESG and responsible investing, so that will be the topic of session 1. Now, the world's changed dramatically since we first planned this conference. So we've had lockdowns, we've had borders closed, but we were determined to hold the conference. And I would really like to thank our speakers for being very flexible. So when we first approached them, we offered them a trip to Paris in spring. And now we've asked them to give presentations which for some people are probably at not very friendly hours. So I really thank our speakers for all coming on board and participating in this online version. And I'm sorry we couldn't make it to Paris, but there's always another year. I'd also like to thank Silke from CEPAR for helping turn this face-to-face conference into an online version, and she's done a terrific job. So I'd really like to thank Silke and also the support of the OECD. Before I hand over to Pablo though, I'd like to announce that the International Pension Research Association is now open for business. So we are a new association. We introduced this to participants last year. And we're established with the aim of improving the quality and impact of research on pensions and related ageing issues to optimise social and economic outcomes for an ageing world. We now have a website, and I'll be putting the website address up during the break. And our website will include details of how to join the association and some of the activities that we have planned for the rest of the year. Now, before I pass on to Pablo, I just want to remind people of some of the ground rules for the conference. So to maximise interaction, we decided to go with Zoom meeting rather than Zoom webinar. And that means that everyone has to be very well behaved and keep their mute on. So make sure if you're not talking, keep your mute on. We want interaction and we'd like you to ask questions. And so during the presentations, if you have questions or after the presentations, use the chat box. And the chairs in each session will look through the chat box and organise the Q&A session. Now, each presentation will go for around 15 minutes, and the way we're organising this, we'll have 3 presentations, and then we'll have 20 to 25 minutes for questions and discussion, which will be moderated by the chair of each session. We have 3 sessions today, and between each session, we'll have a 15-minute break. So make sure that you're ready to come back, have a cup of tea, have a break, and then come back ready for the next session. So I'm looking forward to a terrific afternoon, and I'm now handing over to Pablo.
Well, I just wanted to say good morning, good afternoon, and good night to everybody. I'm speaking in the name of the 2 international organizations that support this endeavor, the OECD and the International Organization of Pension Supervisors. Darius, which is the representative from the IOPS, will be heading one of the sessions later on. And I would like to say that in the name of the OECD and the IOPS, we do consider essential to listen to all stakeholders in the world of pensions. And for us, this is very important because if we want to be able to table reasonable and sound policy guidelines, we need to listen to everybody. And as a result of this approach that we have at the OECD and the IOPS, we have partnered with 3 research institutions that are the ones forming IPRA, and we, the OECD and the IOPS, are working with them. So today, as part of this OECD IOPS outreach activities and this partnership with the research institutions, we have this seminar. And I just want to say welcome to everybody and welcome to the IPRA conference. And please, any of you, do not hesitate to contact either the OECD or the IOPS if you need anything from us. So that's all from me, and let's have a good day. Bye.
Let's get started on the first component of our program. My name is Olivia Mitchell. I'm from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to see so many friends, old and new. And I wanted to start by thanking the OECD and IOPS, especially for continuing to work with us and collaborate with us on this new venture for the International Pension Research Association. So with that, I would like to briefly introduce our 3 speakers. We have a wonderful session here. Our session's entitled Pensions, Sustainable Finance, and Implications for Supervision and Fiduciary Oversight. So the first speaker will be Marie Brière, speaking on personal values, responsible investing, and stock allocation. Dr. Brière is head of the Investor Research Center at Amundi, an affiliate professor at the Paris-Dauphine de Bruxelles, I hope I said that right, and she holds a PhD in economics from the University of Paris-X and graduated from ENSAE. Second, we have Raimond Maurer, a frequent collaborator and co-author of mine. He's a professor of investment, portfolio management, and pension finance at Goethe University of Frankfurt. He received his master's, PhD, and habilitation in business administration from Mannheim University. And his discussion will be on the impacts of money-back guarantees for individual retirement accounts. And then third, we're fortunate to have with us Rebecca Henderson. She's the John and Natty MacArthur Professor, a university professor at Harvard University. She'll be speaking to us on should a pension fund try to change the world inside the GPIF, the Japanese pension system. She earned her PhD in business economics from Harvard University. So with that, I'm going to ask first Marie to speak. You have 15 minutes. Each person will speak in turn, and then we'll have a 25-minute Q&A at the end. If you have questions that you'd like to raise, just type them into the chat box, and I'll do my best to keep going. Thank you, Marie, for sharing your screen.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Can you all see my screen and my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, it's a great pleasure to be here, even if it's only at home, but let's hope next time we can meet physically. and especially to participate to this great conference and this session about sustainable investment, which is growing in interest among institutional investors, but also individual investors. And I think that the recent COVID crisis that we experienced showed also that the interest for ESG is growing. So my presentation will focus on the recent research paper that we are working on with Stefano Ramelli from the University of Zurich, and which is focusing on responsible investing and stock allocation. Before I start, let me give you a little bit of background. So, as I just mentioned, socially responsible investment is increasingly popular among retail investors. And just to quote a few figures on that, for example, in Europe, retail products account now for more than 30% of what we call social responsible investment assets, while in 2013, they accounted only for 3%. And so we had a tremendous growth in the interest of retail investors into ESG. The same growth has been shown in the US, it's now 25%. Slightly lower than in Europe, but we have the same trend. And this growth in this growing demand for ESG is also visible from the pension funds, right? If you look at 401k plans in the US, for example, there is growing interest in that, and that's reflected in the press article that we can read everywhere. And most of the debate on the inclusion of ESG assets, social responsible investment assets in the pension plans has been focusing on the question of the desirability in terms of fiduciary duties and financial return. So the key question was, what about the performance of SRI assets relative to normal, traditional, conventional assets? And is it a good idea to put these assets in the pension fund? But indeed, there is an overlooked point which has not been treated, and in our opinion, it's important, and that's the focus of this research paper, which is the following question. Does the offering of responsible funds affect investors' portfolio decision? Does it affect portfolio risk-taking? So does it modify the asset allocation of individual investors? And indeed, we have good reasons to think that it could have an impact. I'm going to show you why, because as I will show you, that there is growing demand. This growing demand for SRI assets has implication in terms of stock asset allocation. So as we all know, there is a stock market participation puzzle, right? So it's a key topic in household finance. People don't like investing in equities, and that's visible from everywhere in the world, I would say, to various degrees. But here you can see American data, for example, and after the global financial crisis, there was a drop in the equity exposure, and that didn't recover afterwards. So that's a key policy objective for many reasons, but one essential one is that there are large welfare effects of this low participation in the stock market. And as individuals are more and more responsible to invest for their pensions, it's very important that they account for the importance of stock exposure in their asset allocation. So why don't people invest in the equity, or not enough according to financial theory? I mean, it's a puzzle. Huh? So many academics have been trying to bring hypotheses to explain this behavior. And I'm not sure we have the full picture here. I mean, it's probably a combination of various factors, from financial, behavioral, social, and cultural factors. For example, there are informational costs, and it's costly to gather information in the equity market. Behavioral factors like financial literacy and pessimism about future financial market performances based on earlier life experience, for example. But also, interestingly, an important factor that has been highlighted more recently is that there is also, for part of the population, what we call stock market aversion. So some people dislike investing in the stock market, and that's related to the social capital and also to political preferences. I'm going to come back to that in 1 minute. So stock market aversion, it has been shown that left-wing or pro-social investors, they are less likely to invest in stocks because of what we can call a generalized antipathy towards capital market. I mean, there is this famous paper by Kostia and Torstila, and more recent evidence by D'Acunto, Kay, etc., pointing that, for example, in the US, Democrat investors, they tend to invest less in the stock market, but also for Kostia, that was in Finland, so left-wing investors invest less in the stock market. So we know that, and we also know from another bunch of papers that personal values are related to social responsible investment. We also know that these left-wing or pro-social investors, they are more inclined to invest according to social responsible criteria. We have a lot of evidence on that from mutual fund managers by Hong and Kostovetsky, but also from individual investors by Riedel and Smith, Henderson and Robinson, etc. So here comes our conjecture and our hypothesis. So if you combine 1 and 2, it may mean that responsible funds allow pro-social investors to invest in the stock market while avoiding the cognitive dissonance of investing against their values, right? So the offering of socially responsible funds might increase stock market participation. So that's the hypothesis that we are testing in this paper. Does the offering of socially responsible fund change the overall stock allocation of individual investors? To do that, we analyze the 2017 portfolio choices of slightly less than 1 million active participants in employee savings plans in France. What we find, just in a nutshell, is that the inclusion of responsible equity options in the fund's menu is associated with a significant increase in stock market participation by the plan participant. And when we analyze the geographical variation in political preferences, we find that a big part of the effect is driven by social and cultural factors. How do we do that? So as I mentioned, our analysis is based on fresh data, and we are analyzing employee savings plans in France. So I'm not going to detail the French pension system and in particular these types of savings schemes, but just to remind that it's very close to the 401k in the US, right? Except that it's third pillar pension, so it accounts for a lower part of the pension of individuals, but it's very similar in its principle. Employers provide a menu of funds to their employees in these savings schemes. It's very widespread in France, because more than 50% of French employees have access to at least one form of such saving vehicles. But what is probably unique to the French setting is that since 2010, it's mandatory for firms that have more than 50 employees to include at least one responsible fund option, which is called solidarity fund, in the fund menu. Meaning that large firms, they are obliged to propose to their employees in the fund menu a social responsible option. So they are called solidarity funds. And these solidarity funds, they are labeled, so they are accredited by a third party, which is called Financial. And they have a very particular rule that they should invest 5 to 10% of assets in accredited solidarity-based enterprise that should have a social utility. Like, for example, unemployment and that kind of thing. And the rest of the assets, for example, if it's an equity fund, is invested in SRI, ESG classical companies. So we are going to focus here on purely solidarity funds. So we define responsible investing as investment made through the solidarity funds. And there are two main advantages for that. So first, because as I mentioned, these solidarity funds, they have characteristics that are defined by law, which is not the case if you think about standard ESG products. And second, because they are mandatory for large firms, we are much less concerned about the endogeneity nature of responsible fund offering, because you might think that firms that propose SRI fund are also those where employees are more concerned about these issues. Here it's mandatory for everyone, so less endogeneity problems. So our data, we'll analyze cross-sectional data on portfolio decision in 2016 and 2017. As I mentioned, we cover slightly less than 1 million employees in more than 18,000 firms, and we're covering all France, 94 out of the 96 French départements. Key figures, the stock market participation in France in these plans is very low, like everywhere in the world, maybe even lower than in other parts. In average, it's 13%, the average equity allocation in these plans. All plans that have more than 50 employees include at least one solidarity fund that can be equity or balanced, and half of the plan include one solidarity fund, equity of balanced. So, just a few words about our empirical strategy. So how are we going to test that the offering of socially responsible fund is impacting the stock asset allocation? We have two econometric specifications. One is a cross-sectional analysis to compare the share of new contributions that are invested in stocks in 2017 between employees that work in companies where plans offer responsible equity fund versus employee working in plans where there is no responsible equity fund option offered. And then we have a second set of econometric specifications where we run a diff-in-diff analysis. And here we study the change in stock allocation decisions when the employer introduces a new responsible equity fund in the fund's menu. So it's like a treatment. The treatment is the new offering of a responsible fund. And we look how people change their asset allocation when they are offered a new responsible fund in the menu of funds. What do we find? These are the results of the cross-sectional regression. So here we compare the behavior of people that are offered responsible funds versus those not offered. What we find in this cross-sectional analysis, that's in the first column here, that participants in saving plan that offer responsible equity funds, they have a 2.2 higher allocation to stocks than the other participants. When we interact this responsible equity dummy with characteristics of the employees, we find, and these are columns 2, 3, and 4, that the effect is stronger for male, for young participants, and for those having larger accounts. And importantly, and this is the last column, the results are driven by participants' investment in responsible equity fund, as you can see from the last coefficient here. Results from the diff-in-diff regression show similar results. So now we look at the impact of introducing in a new fund, a new responsible fund, in the funds menu. And what we find, let's have a look at column 2. We find that when the firm is introducing a responsible equity fund in the funds menu to its employees, it is associated with an increase in stock allocation of approximately 7%, and is highly significant. And interestingly, we also run a placebo test where we do the same kind of regression, but when we look at the introduction of normal, so classical equity funds, and we find no significant result, right? So that's what you can see here from the first column, that the introduction of a classical equity fund has no impact on the stock allocation, while the addition of a responsible option has an impact as a 7% increase in stock allocation.
Marie, 1 minute left. Please wrap up.
Yes. Okay, so why that? I mean, the main hypothesis that we're going to test is that it's related to personal values. And the reason we do that, because as I mentioned before, there is a strong relationship between personal values and social responsible investment, and also strong relationship between these personal values and political preferences. So the way we're going to test this is to look at a cross-sectional analysis along regional differences in political preferences. So we look at department level variation in the percentage of votes to Green parties at the 2019 European election, and we connect the Department of Residence of individuals in the plan to the regional results to the European election. What do we find? We find that most of the effect is explained by the European election result. When we interact the responsible investment dummy with the result, the percentage of votes to Green Party, we find that the effect of responsible equity fund on the stock allocation is concentrated in areas which have a high support to green party. And we find same result if we look at the left-right political spectrum. So to conclude, what we find in this paper is that responsible investing can increase the stock market participation of a significant part of the population. So I think these results contribute to probably three main strands of the literature. First, about limited stock participation and how to increase it. So we see that maybe designing the right products that appeal individual investors might help in that respect. It also contributes to the role of culture and personal values in financial market decisions. And finally, importantly for this conference, on the role of framing. So we already knew that framing of financial offering has a strong impact on portfolio choices. We confirmed that on this special dimension of social responsible investment. Our results also have policy implications, especially on the actual debate and concerns about the limited stock market participation. So for pension adequacy, as I mentioned in my introduction, but also for the development of European capital market. I mean, it's a strong, it's a very important objective right now of the European Commission and also ESMA, how to make the capital union more lively and to attract investors. And what we show here, which is probably also important for these questions, is that the attractiveness of the equity market in general and equity fund in particular is not only linked to their financial performance, but also to their ability to attract investors that would otherwise not have been willing to invest in capital markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please unshare your screen.
Yes.
And with that, I would like to invite Raimond Maurer to please share his screen.
Okay, so again, can you hear me all?
Perfect.
Olivia? Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for inviting me virtually to Paris to talk about regulatory challenges for the pan-European pension. So what is the pan-European personal pension product, or in short, the PEP, yeah, which has nothing to do with the current monetary policy by the ECB, to be clear on that. So this pension product was adopted last year by the European Parliament, and the idea is to establish a standardized, portable, tax-qualified personal pension of the DC variety, complementary to public pensions and offered by regulated financial institutions like asset managers, life insurance companies, or banks. So you see the blueprint is something like the individual retirement accounts in the US, yeah, which is available for all states in the US. And with this product, they try to do a similar product here in Europe. The idea is to use the capital market to finance retirement, which is, I think, a good idea if you do this complementary to public pensions, to link long-term savings to long-term investments, and which is very important now. It should have access for all around 220 million workers in the European member states. Should open market for all providers and all consumer, should be portable, and also it should break up the fragmented markets of funded pensions in the different countries, what you have in Europe. So that's the idea. And now there are some regulatory challenges. Yeah? And you can imagine that to find a compromise across all of these member states in Europe is not easy. So there is something to do. And I want to focus here on three topics. First, and I start with the most difficult one, is taxation. Yeah? It should be tax qualified, but you have in the different member states different tax regimes. Yeah? And the usual one, what you find in many member states, like in the US, is the so-called deferred taxation incentive scheme. This is in most European member states. So if you contribute, you make it out of tax-free income. You don't have to pay taxes on investment returns. And then if you withdraw, you have to pay taxes on the withdrawals. This is the reason why it's called deferred taxation. But if you have 29 different tax regimes, there are some problems. I give you an example. Yeah? You work for 20 years in Germany. The marginal tax rate is 45%. You don't have to pay taxes in Germany. Then you work for another 20 years in France. The marginal tax rate is 50%. You don't have to pay taxes on this part in France. And then you retire and make withdrawal in Malta, which is a very nice country. And you have to pay 35% taxes on withdrawal in Malta. Yeah, to which, you know, do the different finance ministers or tax authority accept that? Yeah, so you give the tax incentive, and when you withdraw, you do it in another country. Not easy to do. The solution is that you have to, that the PEP should compromise national sub-accounts. This means, yeah, that a product provider has to track which contribution is coming when from which country, and if you make withdrawals, then they have to transfer different taxes to the different countries. You can imagine that's very nice for tax accountants, yeah, but is this nice for portfolio managers and so on? Is it very difficult and complicated for consumers? So what's the solution? The best solution is unify the tax regime in Europe. I think we can wait another couple of years if this is done. Another opportunity, which is also difficult, but maybe a little bit easier, is to make the tax incentives special for the PEP product as a front-end taxation. So you contribute out of taxable income. Yeah. So all of the finance ministers are fine with that. And then the support, the tax incentive is that you don't tax the investment returns. And if you withdraw, you have nothing to do with taxes. This could be a solution. Second challenge is accumulations. The accumulation part should compromise a default option. So if you go to a product provider and you say nothing, the money, your contribution should go into a default option, which is very important. We know that from the experience in the US. So the default option, which is called the so-called basic PEP, the default investment option, should be a safe product using, on the one side, guarantees of at least the contribution during the accumulation phase. So we have a kind of a money back guarantee, what we have here in our special plans in Germany, in the Riester plans. But okay, asset managers don't like that, yeah, because there are solvency requirements, and especially in the current low interest rate environment, you have high guarantee costs. Have a look to this table, yeah. So here's an example. We have some saving plans, and now you ask the question, how much of the contribution you have to set aside to buy some put option to realize a guarantee. Yeah, if you have a 3% interest rate and about 40 years investment horizon, you have to pay about 10% of your contribution as hedging costs. If you have the current low interest rate environment with 0%, this is increasing up to 36% of each contribution, which is a lot of. But the regulation allows, instead of a guarantee, also other risk mitigation techniques, yeah, with the objective to allow the PEP saver to recoup the capital. And now what everybody is discussing, what are these other risk mitigation techniques which make a compromise on the one side to participate in the equity markets that are safe enough, and it should be also rule-based. Yeah? And this is, these discussions are so-called life cycle investing, what you know also for the 401k plan as a default investment option in the US. And the question now is, what are appropriate principles for life cycle funds? Yeah? The tradition in Europe is that you have to write this down. It's not simply make your best and then we have a look. We need some rules. And who is responsible? Now EIOPA, the European Pension and Insurance Regulator, is in charge to develop some principles. And now there are many opportunities what you can do. So a life cycle fund is a kind of an automatic shift from equities into bonds with age. Yeah, here are some two examples, which is the blue line is the very traditional 1 minus age rule. So you start with 100 minus, let's say if you are 25, with 75% in equities, and then each year when you become older, you switch more into bonds, or you can have longer equities as 100%, and then later on you switch it into bonds. Yeah. So this is at the moment in the discussion, and the question is now is how can you test that? Yeah. And here's our contribution. Or by the way, all of these numeric results is based on a paper what I have written together with Olivia. We can also send it around. It's an NBR working paper. If you are interested in the precise numerical results, you can do that. So what we like to do in testing this in these different policy opportunities is the following. So we create a quite realistic life cycle portfolio and consumption model. Yeah? So what does it mean? We have consumers with individual preferences across consumption, not of final wealth, across consumption. They start at the age of 25, then they retire at the age of 67, and the maximum age is 100. Yeah? And then we track all of these institutional details. So we are looking to calibrating the labor income process and the labor income risk. The state pension is involved. We have all of these here. In this case, it's for the German work, for the German situation. We have the complete German social security system inside, the tax rules, and so on and so on. You have financial assets. You can invest in equity and bonds in or outside such a tax qualified account. All relevant institutional rules, housing, inflation, and so on and so on. Then we solve that, and the outcome is labor income, saving and consumption. Here we are interested in consumption because this enters into the utility function, asset allocation, and how much you invest into assets in or outside a PEP account. And within this framework, we test now a life cycle investing strategy versus a guarantee. Details are technical details are given in the paper. So here are the outcomes. So we are testing now life cycle investing strategy versus having a guarantee. The guarantee is realized by buying put options with reasonable prices, and the specific life cycle investment strategy, what we are looking here is you stay in 100% equity until the age of 40, and then each year you go down by 2.5%. We have tested many other of these life cycle investing strategy, but in the matter of time, I report only one. So here is one result. What you find here is we have more than 100,000 of simulation, many individuals with different backgrounds, education, and so on. And what you see here is the difference in each year in consumption if you have a guarantee case versus if you have this life cycle case. Yeah, so this is what you see here. This is really the complete spectrum. This blue line is the average consumption difference, and the red line is the zero line. So how can you interpret this? So we are here in the historical normal return environment with an interest rate of about 3%, in an inflation rate of close to 2%. This is what we are calling in a historical normal environment. If you read this picture, all points, which we are graphically showing in the so-called fan charts, which are above the zero line, shows you have higher consumption if you have a life cycle fund compared to the same situation if you have a guarantee. And if in all points which are below the red line is the difference, you have a higher consumption level if you have a guarantee compared to a life cycle investing. So, and what you see here in the historical normal environment with a 3% interest rate, these kind of guarantees are not so really expensive, and you find that you have in most cases a better consumption level in the guarantee case compared to this life cycle investing. The next graph shows you the probability in each year, or the fraction of how many people in our sample have a higher consumption in the guarantee case compared to the life cycle investing. And you see here, it's something about 50 to 60% of the individuals have a higher consumption with a guarantee case compared to the life cycle investing. And now the last number is the last number is here the shortfall probability. This shows you the number of in how many cases with a life cycle investment strategy you have lower assets in your retirement account at the age of 67 compared to the contribution where you pay in. So the number is 1.3%, which is not a lot. Yeah, so also this life cycle investment strategy have very low shortfall probability in the sense that you do not recoup the capital. Now let's change the complete situation to the current interest rate environment, 0% interest rate, low inflation, and so on. Now I show you right away the complete picture. This is the low interest rate environment. Guarantees are super expensive. So in most of the cases with the life cycle investing, we are much better compared to the guarantee, yeah, which shows you this one. But you have to accept a higher shortfall probability of about 70.6%. So life cycle investing in a low interest rate environment shows you much higher possibility of a higher consumption, but you have to accept the financial shortfall probability that you cannot recoup the capital. So the last point is the regulatory change. The current regulation is on decumulation. And on decumulation, basically the regulation is silent. Yeah? You find basically nothing. No mandatory annuitization, no regulation for drawdowns, no default for any kind of payout options. At the moment, we see nothing. Maybe a suggestion, yeah, is I think we should not start to make too much things mandatory. Yeah, but the learning lessons in the US is that many people know that these deferred annuities, where you buy at the beginning of retirement, starting the payouts at the age of 80 or 85, make a lot of sense. They are cheap and they're insurance exactly what you want. They insure the longevity risk. Maybe we can go in this direction. This is all what I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Raimond. Excellent job. Let me then ask you to unshare your screen. Thank you. And Rebecca, you're up.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed the two research presentations we've just seen. They were hugely interesting. Thank you very much. This is not a research presentation. I am about to briefly summarize a teaching case. I teach at the Harvard Business School, and I lead the required first-year course in leadership and corporate accountability. And this case was written to introduce MBA students to the concept of universal investors and to ask the question, should universal investors be trying to reduce the systemic risk facing the economic system? So we focus on the GPIF and particularly on Hiro Mizuno when he was the chief investment officer at the GPIF. So in the spirit of a teaching case, what I'm going to do is ask questions. I am going to attempt to summarize Hiro's investment strategy, and then I'm going to explore the barriers to realizing this strategy and ask whether they can be overcome. So let me begin by giving you some basic facts about the GPIF. The GPIF manages and invests the reserve fund for the Japanese national pension and employee pension under the supervision of the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare. Japan has one of the largest pension systems in the world, and the GPIF is the largest individual pension plan in the world. It has about 1.7 trillion under management, depending on the yen-dollar exchange rate. As of March 2018, about 28% of this was in domestic bonds, about 15% in foreign bonds, 25% in domestic equities, and 24% in foreign equities. This represents the result of a significant change in the investment strategy of the GPIF, which was implemented beginning in 2014. Before 2014, the GPIF invested almost entirely in Japanese state bonds, but the returns to Japanese state bonds were so low that there was concern about the long-term viability of the pension system. And so the decision was made to diversify the pension into equities and into foreign bonds. As a result, the GPIF now holds about 7% of the Japanese equity market and about 1% of the global equity market. This is a very large percentage. Hiro jokes in the case that it is enough to ensure that anyone on the planet returns his phone calls. So not enough to move the market, but enough to get attention. And we'll come back to this point later. Hiro, as he came to run the investment strategy of the GPIF, came to think of himself as a universal owner or a universal investor. This is a phrase I'm sure is familiar to many of you. As Hiro defined it, he said the GPIF is not interested in making excess returns. That is, he came to believe that the name of the game was not seeking alpha, but instead that he had a duty to make the whole system more viable. And in particular, he was facing on the three elements of ESG: governance, which in Japan is or has historically had a very different form than governance in Europe and the US, and is considered by many to be rather too favorable to management. So many Japanese firms remain without significant independent representation on their boards and remain relatively insulated from stock market pressure. So Hiro came to believe that one of the things he could do to drive the long-term return to his portfolio was significantly improve governance in Japan and elsewhere. Secondly, he came to believe that climate change was a very significant risk to the long-term health of the portfolio. Japan is particularly exposed to climate change risk, but he believed his entire portfolio that this was perhaps the largest risk to long-term performance. And lastly, under S, as you may know, GPIF has, Japan has a significant demographic issue. The population is aging very rapidly, and current estimates suggest that the best way, or one of the best ways to improve the long-term performance of the Japanese economy is to improve social inclusion, in particular by increasing the role of women in the Japanese economy. Japan has one of the lowest rankings of women's participation in the workforce of any developed nation. So this was the underlying investment thesis, which is I'm not going to chase the best individual stock return. I'm going to try and improve the performance of the entire portfolio. And that is in the long-term interest of the pensioners to whom the GPIF is responsible. This thesis raises three questions, well, at least three questions, but let me focus on three questions here. The first is it consistent with GPIF's fiduciary duty? After all, these are externalities in the classic sense. And indeed, as I'm sure you're all aware, the US government has just ruled that pension funds may not address in ESG funds if it's not directly related to the financial returns. So first big question, is this consistent with fiduciary duty? Secondly, if it is, how should GPIF exercise this responsibility? For political reasons and the concern that GPIF could exercise undue control over, in particular, the Japanese economy. If they own 7% of the equity market, you could imagine that would be a concern. Not all, the vast majority of GPIF's investments are managed through asset managers. And most of their investments are in passive funds because it's such a large portfolio and because they're seeking to moderate risk and because Hero doesn't believe they should be chasing alpha. The vast majority is in passive investment funds, and these are asset managers who by and large have historically had not much capability in the ESG front and not much interest in developing it. Returns to an asset manager managing a passive portfolio are very, very low. And so one big question Hero faced is, how do I get my asset managers to focus on ESG and to believe my investment thesis? And last, but by no means least, can the GPIF solve or help to solve the collective action problems inherent in this model? Because while one might believe that yes, there is a systemic risk to the long-term health of the GPIF portfolio, and that addressing climate change and problems like social inclusion might help you address that systemic risk, if only GPIF believes this, many firms may say, well, that's very interesting, you know, it's some activity at the margin, but we're not really going to change our behavior. Is EP, you know, maybe GPIF wants us to improve our ESG rankings, but we have other things to do, and these are externalities, and don't bother me. So how do we think about these three questions? On fiduciary duty, so Hero claimed two things. The first is that when he looked back at the returns to his alpha-seeking funds, the fees those asset managers were charging were on average higher than the excess return they were yielding. So he looked at historical returns and he said, you're not giving me alpha. Why should I invest? And indeed, this is of course a reading consistent with classic research, which is if you have to hold too much of the market, the chance of generating supernormal returns over time are quite small. So he claims that it is entirely consistent with his fiduciary duty to seek to reduce beta. That for a pool of capital as large as the GPIF, the major shocks to return have been the major risks to the portfolio. And he instances, for example, the 2008 financial crash. He says, you know, if we'd been able to avoid the effects of the crash, that would have had far more effect on my long-term return than any marginal returns from alpha. And similarly, as I mentioned, that if I could reduce the risk of climate change and if I could greatly increase social inclusion in Japan, that those are the kinds of returns that would really generate long-term sustainable returns. Notice that in the short term, this thesis suggests that Hero is not claiming this strategy will generate supernormal returns in the short term. This is a risk reduction strategy. So although we can debate whether GPIF returns are higher or lower, and indeed ESG in general, Hero would say, no, I'm generating longer, more stable returns over the long term for my pensioners. And that is entirely consistent with my fiduciary duty. On the second question of implementation, Hero adopted a three-point strategy. The first was to aggressively and publicly embrace ESG as an important thing that Japanese firms and the Japanese public should be aware of. He started running high-profile conferences. He put a significant fraction of the GPIF equity resources into ESG indices. And in general, he made a fuss. And there's some evidence that he, at the very least, increased awareness of ESG. Historically, Japanese awareness and investment in ESG-related funds had been extremely low, much lower than OECD average. It's now creeping towards OECD average. So he certainly increased awareness of sort of what ESG was and why you might want to invest in it. As we suggest in the case, while it was relatively easy to persuade people that governance was an issue, there was some significant degree of skepticism about environmental and social issues as means to increase returns. And this was a particular issue as he sought to change the incentive structures for asset managers. He started pushing his asset managers to actively engage with the firms in their portfolio. And he started to require that they reveal their proxy voting behavior. Historically, many of the asset managers had not engaged with firms in their portfolio, particularly in Japan, and had not disclosed their proxy voting results. So he said, I want you to care about ESG, and I will include this in your incentive structure. And this was a hard sell, particularly among smaller asset managers that did not have ESG-related capacity. Notice that if you're an asset manager and GPIF is only some small fraction of your assets, investing in ESG capacity is going to be a major upfront cost, which you might perhaps be only able to amortize over a small fraction of the portfolio. So a lot of reaction, a lot of pushback against this move, you know, hey, hero, we don't know how to engage, and there are lots of us, should we all engage with every firm in our portfolio? So a significant difficulty in pushing asset managers into line.
2 minutes.
Thank you. With the exception of BlackRock, which is GPIF's largest customer, and as you know, has at least publicly announced a major commitment to moving in this direction. The third question that Hiro faced, and perhaps the most important, is the collective action problem. So it is the case that control of most public companies is about to be concentrated in the hands of a dozen or fewer people. I cannot make up my mind whether this is good news or deeply concerning. As I'm sure you're aware, there is a very significant research literature exploring whether the growth of universal investors is driving increased collusion amongst firms in their portfolio. It could be potentially a way to address major externalities like climate change and social inclusion. So if we believe that problems of environmental degradation and accelerating inequality are major threats to the health of the portfolio, we could perhaps imagine universal investors solving the collective action problem. If there's only 12 people that you need to convince, and if their performance can be monitored, that is, if there is widespread adoption of replicable, auditable material ESG metrics, you could imagine solving the collective action problem. And I think the big question here is, will they choose to act? Are initiatives like Climate Action 100 a way forward? I myself believe that this kind of action is entirely consistent with fiduciary duty, that if the collective action problem could be solved, this does indeed hold out the promise of very significantly reducing long-term risks to the health of the world's economic system, and with it risks to the long-term returns of the world's pension funds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will now open the floor for questions.